Adaptation. Thank you, Will. Winikisek, Natasuis, Casey Thornbrook, and Thomas Masipia. Good day. And as Will had introduced me, my name is Casey Thornbrook, and I'm a citizen of the Mashi Wampanoag tribe. I'm here to present on tribal and indigenous-based climate adaptation priorities in the Northeast. Well, seem to have a slide change issue here. Let me just stop share for a moment, regroup, and there we go. Okay, apologies for that. We'll go ahead and share screen. Okay, had some technical issues here, so we're just going to go with this one. So I can just kind of click through right here. So first, I want to speak a little bit about my role and who I'm employed with. As well as stated, I am a Tribal Climate Science Liaison and Program Manager. I'm employed by an intertribal organization known as United South and Eastern Tribes, also known as USET. USET is a nonprofit intertribal organization established in 1969, currently serving 33 tribal nations. The center picture here, you can see a map of the geography of the USET region and locations of member tribal nations. The mission of USET is dedicated to enhancing the development of federally recognized tribal nations, to improving the capabilities of tribal governments, and assisting the USET members and their governments in dealing effectively with public policy issues and in serving the broad needs of Indian people. Briefly, the pictures on the far right, the top, are the some of the founding tribal leaders of USET. The middle picture are some of the picture of the more current tribal leaders who sit on the board, USET's board of directors. And then the picture below, which we'll be updating this year as we have our in-person meetings again, but this is our USET technical support staff, which actually has grown quite a bit over the past 3 years.
Casey, sorry to interrupt. I don't know, do you want to be in presenter mode, or is this what works for you? I just wasn't sure.
Thank you. Yes, it's okay. I had some screen freezing issues in presenter mode, so I decided just to hop over into this mode.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, so the most important thing I want to share is that tribal nations are sovereign governments with agencies, and this is something to really think about in terms of the tribal engagement space. Often you'll hear tribal nations or tribes referred to as communities, which yes, there are communities within tribal nations. Some tribal nations with smaller populations, the community and the nation may be one and the same. There are also larger tribal nations that may have multiple communities. But nations implies sovereignty, and that's really important here. And as sovereign governments with agencies, it's important to understand that within tribal nations, there's public safety and justice, education and culture, environmental protection, and these are all like agencies, whether, for example, like you think of the United States and it has like the Environmental Protection Agency, a tribal nation might have an Environmental Protection Office or a Natural Resource Department. Maybe it has a staff of 5, maybe it has a staff of 30, but that is the agency responsible for environmental protection of the lands and community of that particular tribal nation. So this is really important in terms of looking again in connecting with tribal nations and acknowledging that tribal nations are sovereign governments with agencies. So tribal nations are nations that predate the United States and many European nations. I have a background in geography, and that's why I bring up some of these maps. And I've always been interested in geography, even in my K through 12 days. In my experience in school, and I'm sure many of us may have experienced this, but there's a focus on US history and geography, and then world history and world geography. And students are expected to know, or at least be aware of, the countries around the world. And I'm showing like this, picture of Europe here, and a map of language families. And, countries often, have a language and culture associated with it. And we have the same. Tribal nations in North and South America, we're made up of many various language and language families. And, if you were to map it, it might look something like this in the East. And these have evolved into our many different tribal nations. So basically, I say, like, you think of tribal nations like countries, self-governing, sovereign, long existing, and with that sense of identity. So I'm going to go through these 4 slides here, as brief and concise as possible for context. As I said, a lot of times in K through 12 education, and even in college post-secondary education, there's a focus on American history and geography, and then world history and world geography, but not as big a focus on the history of tribal nations on this continent. One would often has to take an elective in that, or to major in something such as American Indian or Native American studies. There's, from a tribal nations perspective, at least in the United States, there's different eras in history that develop the relationship that tribal nations have with the United States, and how it is today. And again, this is important for context. So I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but I'm going to try to make a point from each one. Again, this is something like a semester's worth of material, and even multiple classes to cover this. But essentially, one of the things from the perspective of tribal nations is the formative era, and that's first contact, whenever that happened for any given tribal nation. For some, it was 1492. For others, it might have been 1800. Every tribal nation had first contact with a European nation at some point, or people of at some point, through about 1871. There's the doctrine of discovery, which is basically European nations who self-identify as Christian nations, being given kind of the go-ahead from the Pope to when coming upon what would be the Americas, if they came across places where the people, where Christianity wasn't even a thing yet, they could kind of lay claim to those lands. In some cases it was violent. In a lot of cases it was violent. In other cases it was subversive. But one of the things that came out of that was treaties between European nations and tribal nations, and then later between the United States and tribal nations. And why this is important is treaties happen between countries. So there's an acknowledgement of one sovereign to another sovereign. And so that begins to, acknowledge tribal nations as sovereign nations. There are other really difficult things that occurred during that time: forced removal, tribal land cessation, and then unceded lands. Sometimes you may hear that, and unceded lands is maybe a tribal nation of that area was forced out, not through through violence or through threat of violence, but never voluntarily ceded those lands through any treaty. So you might hear that as well. The next era is known as allotment and assimilation. So, kind of once the United States made its way over to the West Coast, remaining lands, which were often identified as reservations, there's all kinds of pressure to open them up for settlement. And what begins to happen is tribal lands become allotted, which is a process of, like, removing parcel by parcel of lands away from tribal nations and jurisdictions, and it starts to kind of really like checkerboard tribal nation lands. 90 million acres of tribal lands are lost during this period. Another issue is removal of Indigenous youth from families. And this is a really big issue in history, because a lot of this is removal of tribal youth to off-reservation boarding schools and things like that, where speaking the language was forbidden and punitive. And one of the things, you have to kind of use your imagination here. Like, let's use English, for example. If that's your first language or mother tongue, if you will, or any language, the language that you feel comfortable, you joke in, you express your feelings in, and communicate. Well, imagine if you were taken and put in a place where you weren't allowed to speak English, and you were punished for doing so, and what that would do to you and your family. And so why this is relevant today is we have many tribal nations where cultural recovery is a real big issue, like bringing our languages back. I introduced myself in our Wampum language. I'm not fluent in it. I'm learning it as an adult. And again, just imagine that, like, again, if your ancestors were not allowed to speak English, and then you are learning how to speak English, and you are learning how to say "my name is," and it would be a big deal. So there's a lot of regrouping happening. The Indian Reorganization Era, 1928 through 1945, roughly. This is where at least allotment legally is stopped, and the pendulum starts to turn the other way for tribal nations to start to try to reacquire lands that were taken, and lands that would be placed in trust by the federal government on behalf of a tribal nation. It's also a time when the federal government, even though sovereignty is inherent, starts to move towards acknowledging that tribal nation governments, a return to acknowledging that tribal nations are sovereign to control our own destinies. The pendulum turns the other way, 1945 through 1968, and that's where there's a termination of federal recognition of tribal nations, over 100, and termination of tribal lands and trusts and jurisdiction given to states, counties, and local municipalities. There was also the 1956 Indian Relocation Act, to encourage families to leave tribal nations and move to urban areas. So this is like, one of the things that was happening around this time was the United States attempting to relieve, I guess, itself of responsibility through trust and treaty to tribal nations, through kind of a forced assimilation. Okay, and now to the self-determination era, which is really approximately 1968 through the present. Again, the pendulum swings back the other way, and you have presidents acknowledging that again, tribal nations are sovereign, but also that the United States has a trust and treaty obligation to support tribal nations and provide resources and funding to do so. Other things that happened during this time, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in the late 1970s. And then in the 1980s, you start to see federal agencies, for example, here, the environmental US EPA, developing Indian policy, consultation, and federal funding to support formal tribal environmental agencies being started. So in more recent decades, we're kind of still in the self-determination era, but how that unfolds changes through changing administrations and changing representation in Congress. So we still have challenges now. we have to think of this in the context now, adding climate change and its impacts on what's already happening here. And so there was a Supreme Court decision known as the Carcieri decision that limited land and trust to tribal nations federally recognized in 1934. This was a major barrier for tribal nations, requiring movement of communities, but potentially the impacted by sea level rise and climate change. So, these kind of things are coming in, and tribal nations have to also think about. My own tribal nations lands and trusts were challenged in 2020. And, we have to kind of think about that again on top of climate change issues. In the recent couple of years and this year's, there's been a substantial increase in federal funding for tribal nations to address climate change. And this is good. However, there's some still challenges because this is competitive funding and project based. So it's a little harder to get longer term climate change adaptation planning going and implemented and consistent over time. So why I gave it all that background is to acknowledge, like, okay, there's a trust and treaty obligation between the United States and its federal agencies to tribal nations. So what is this trust and treaty obligation? The history I talked about before is why we have it. So essentially, tribal nations ceded millions of acres of land and natural resources to the United States, often involuntary or out of necessity to prevent the killing of our people who sought to protect our families, our homelands, and way of life. These ceded lands and natural resources are the very foundation of the wealth and power that the United States and its citizens enjoy today. In this exchange, the United States made promises that exist in perpetuality to ensure that Native peoples' health, overall well-being, and prosperity. This exchange is the basis for its trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations and Native people. So coming back to tribal nations as governments with agencies, it's very important to understand tribal nations in the context of the American family of governments. So, there's the federal government, and then there's states, and states have their own agencies, and states have their own governments. There are also tribal nations, also with our own governments, with our own agencies, kind of looking at on the same level here. So rethinking geography, I think, is important in tribal nation engagement. As I said earlier, in geography, there's an expectation that people have an awareness and knowledge of location of US states, capitals, major cities, and world countries. And that's kind of what's emphasized in K through 12 education. But when you think about it, do you know the names and locations of the 25 federally recognized tribal nations in the Northeast? And a lot of people do not unless you work for a tribal organization or a tribal liaison. These things aren't immediately taught. So going into the Northeast, just a little background. This is a map we've been working on, kind of a work in progress here of the tribal nations in the Northeast CASC region. There are 25 federally recognized tribal nations. Plus, that we need to think about also federally recognized tribal nations that are located outside this region, but have homelands or original homelands within the region. In addition to, we also have numerous state or state commission recognized tribal nations and communities. Just real quick in that sense, the trust and treaty obligation on a federal level is not quite, set in stone for that, but we have to think about, there are many, state recognized or non-federally recognized tribal nations that have been seeking federal recognition for a long time. My own tribal nation, it was about 30 years. We started in the 1970s and we obtained federal recognition in 2007. In my tenure as tribal climate science liaison, 6 tribal nations have obtained federal recognition. So again, it's important to be aware of that geography and kind of look around in your area. Okay, So let me pivot over to climate. And so we now have this background, but we think about climate change from tribal perspectives. We've had experience, our tribal nations has had experience with climate change since time immemorial. Um, and these changes are observations. We basically had front row seats to epic and major changes over the course of thousands of years. Seeing the glaciers in the Northeast recede, seeing the isostatic rebound of lands, and then sea level rise coming in. These are often in our stories. Many tribal programs, including my own, have our youth programs, and sharing, of course, the kind of textbook science that we're getting in school, but also our traditional knowledge that we have had and have passed down. These stories are very special. We don't take them for granted, and we try not to just share them at any old time. So when you find yourself um, having the privilege or the opportunity to hear some of these stories, it's a very important and special thing. Um, but even though we've seen climate change over thousands of years, 20th and 21st century climate change that's happening on the order of decades or within a generation poses a greater immediate impact on our tribal nations, tribal homelands, and oceans we are connected to. And these are just some of the, of course, we look at the Arctic and melting of the glaciers and Greenland ice sheet, but the impacts more regionally in the Northeast with sea level rise, changing elevation of boreal forests. And then this last picture on the far right, this is actually in Southern Appalachians. This is the Gatlinburg fire, which occurred in the Cherokee homelands. And a lot of focus on fire you hear from out west, but we have to also be concerned with fire in the east as well. We are seeing shortening winters and warmer summers in some places in the Northeast. Spring snowmelt is occurring almost 2 weeks earlier than it had in the 1960s. The Northeast is seeing an increase in the number of 80 plus and 90 plus days by about 20 days since the 1960s. Why this matters is it impacts the plants and animals and ecosystems of this space. And our tribal nations, our stories and our identities very much is tied and connected with these species. When we say our culture and history started here, so we don't have a place, another continent that we can trace to and be yeah, our language comes from here, or our stories come from here. Our language and stories developed in this place, and the connection we have with these species, or which we'll refer to often as our relatives in this place. Should these species move, tribal nations often have to deal with, are these our relatives moving in places that are out of our homelands, and these kinds of things, because our homelands, because of our history, are very fixed today. And we have to think about those kind of items. We also have to think of, as many governments, whether it's federal or state governments or municipalities as well, the impacts of more frequent and costly extreme weather events. My own tribal nation and many others we have our own emergency departments or agencies. And here on Cape Cod, with the location of my tribal nation, we have our own emergency response agency or Homeland Security. And it makes me think of over the past few years how frequent tornado warnings have become. I think many would agree that tornadoes, although they can happen, are definitely much more infrequent on Cape Cod than, say, inland or the central part of the US. But we're seeing more severe storms in the summer, and seeing more of these warnings that our tribal nation is responding to and alerting our own tribal citizens about, as just one example of severe weather. Sea level rise and coastal flooding. One of the things that is a concern is when sea level rise impacts coastal areas that we go to fish, to gather, where there's also culturally important plants. And the East has rural spaces, but along the coast, it is a little more urban. And sometimes there are smaller pockets of these kind of remaining lands that citizens from tribal nations can access. And when we're seeing sea level rise impact those plants, that's a concern. There are some tribal nations on the East Coast that have infrastructure that is close to the water, that they're going to have to look at moving that infrastructure in kind of the mid-level or higher sea level rise projections. Changes in the oceans, a lot of, especially for coastal tribal nations, our foods come from the oceans, and changes in whether it's the temperature or conditions that are that lead to hazardous algal blooms impact our ability to, subsist. And we have both subsistence and commercial fishing amongst tribal nations. There are, of course, subsistence, those of tribal citizens that fish to feed our families and to keep traditional foods going. And also there are some tribal citizens and tribal businesses that harvest and sell fish and shellfish. So economic development is part of this as well. So I'd like to give an example of some tribal-based or indigenous-based climate adaptation. And one of the things I wanted to highlight and make sure people were aware of is this work done by Dr. Kelsey Leonard. She is a citizen of the Shinnecock Indian Nation on Long Island. And she and her team had been working on this and produced a paper on it known as the Wampum Adaptation Framework. And Wampum, I actually have on my chain here. This is comes from the quahog shell, and we have it in our jewelry. We also have it as part of our culture and many Eastern tribal cultures. Sometimes it's used to tell stories. Sometimes it's been used in treaties. It's really an important thing. But their program turned the Wampum as an acronym for an Indigenous adaptation framework. So the acronym standing for witnessing the warnings from human and non-human relations on following the pattern. So if you're seeing the sea level rise, witnessing it and starting to think about how I'm going to respond. Acknowledge the traditional teachings and restoring cultural stewardship practices. So using your own history, culture, and values to respond. And that's like, drawing from your own. Mending the shoreline. There are tribal nations, for example, this picture on the bottom here is on the lands and seaways of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead. Their community has been working really hard to restore sand dunes and beach grass to be resilient to storm surge impacting roads in and around their nation. Protecting cultural sites and ancestors, and thinking about where those sites are, and thinking about if climate change and sea level rise is going to pose a threat to those sites and how to protect them, and to unite to work with other tribal nations as well to build capacity to address climate change and sea level rise. And then move is one of those things where in some worst case scenarios where sea level rise is going to impact where your community infrastructure homes are, and you are in a position where you're having to move the community, keeping your sovereignty and self-determination in terms of where and how we move, and in a space that we're still culturally connected to, and also keeping our cultural connection with the places that we may have moved from. Whether the water comes in, it's still our cultural space. It's still our spot. So kind of thinking along those lines. So I encourage anyone to please take a look at this article. With our program, our climate resilience program with USET, we are working closely with tribal nations that are working on climate change vulnerability assessments and or adaptation plans. Many tribal nations now, and even more so with kind of an increase in funding over the past couple of years, are using those funds to put energy and resources to establish vulnerability assessments or adaptation plans for our respective tribal nations. We at USET and our program provide technical support to help review some drafts of these plans. And then with permission from tribal nations and those working on these plans, share them with other experts that might be able to weigh in terms of climate projections and things that would further inform these plans. So our support is really very, I would say, tangible. We have not, in terms of our program, done a lot of research yet because research has not been asked of us yet. And so our program really responds to what is asked. And if tribal nations are asking for review and support and time to work on climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans, our charge is to make that happen or put tribal nation managers in contact with people that can help that to happen. We also have numerous meetings and conferences. Of course, during the pandemic, those were all virtual, but things are starting to open up again, and we are looking to do some more in-person meetings for tribal nation leaders and managers to discuss where things are at with climate adaptation planning. Okay, just gonna move down here. I'm going to start concluding here, and we'll have some time for some questions and discussion. I wanted to conclude on some thoughts on respectful engagement of tribal nations. This is not an exclusive list by any means, but just some things that I think are important to think about. I've been in the role of tribal liaison for a little over 4 years now, and had various experiences that I think are important to share. So in terms of respectful engagement of tribal nations, it's important to think why. Like, why are you engaging? If you're a federal agency or work for a federal agency, then the trust and treaty obligation is very important, a very clear part of why engagement is important. You're obligated to connect and make sure that you're working closely with tribal nations. Kind of like going through that exercise of the 5 whys to really get to the bottom of something. Like, I'm doing this because, okay, why? Because this, okay, and so on and so forth. This allows, I think, people to be honest with oneself, so you can be honest with others. Some other things is maybe it's just maybe it's a personal interest, and as long as that's communicated up front, maybe a person brings a skill set that is really valuable and useful to a concern or priority of a tribal nation, or for example, like working for USET, we're like technical support providers, so that's why we are connecting. I went to a meeting a little while ago, and we were talking about this engagement, and a colleague of mine brought this up, and sometimes they talk about human to human engagement, the golden rule: do unto others what you would do unto yourself. But we were talking about my colleague was talking about taking on a higher level, which was, do unto others as they would do unto themselves. And that requires learning about folks. That requires learning about the history, values, and cultures of those you're working with. It's very important then to attempt to understand the world from tribal perspectives. Some things I'm seeing that I do want to mention too is it's important to use terms that people and nations are more likely to use for themselves in terms of high esteem and self-respect. I've seen a lot of things in like the literature and even grant applications that use something like disadvantaged or disadvantaged communities, and I kind of crossed that out. I've seen in my tenure tribal nations like kind of reject a grant application because it was asking them to say how, like, they're a disadvantaged community and things like that. And so, as I shared in my presentation, yes, a lot of things have happened, and there's a lot of challenges that tribal nations face. But you kind of, again, think about like, how would you hold yourself as an individual, and want to be viewed as an individual? Would you want to be viewed as disadvantaged, or would you rather be viewed as, resilient, honorable, dignified? Like, yes, there are challenges, but you are going to address them. So think about using the terms of the highest esteem, and that. Learn or ask the proper name and pronunciation of tribal nation names. Again, I think correct human to human engagement, honesty and transparency. Think of how you would treat your family or people whose well-being is near and dear to you. Um, Also respecting people's times, priorities, and situations. And I'm thinking about like with engagement of tribal nation leaders and management. Um, Sometimes from the space of universities or academic institutions or research institutions, there's outreach and uh, emailing, or calling tribal managers. And what I ask people to understand is that often, what is the case for tribal leaders and tribal managers is the well-being and work of our own nations comes first as the top priority. So myself, having been a natural resource manager for my own tribal nation, like, I need to respond to the emails of my tribal nation and the phone calls of my tribal nation first to make sure I'm doing that. And so just kind of thinking along those times, like, tribal leaders and tribal managers were accountable to our tribal nations, with our time and time use and all these kinds of things. So partnerships can happen, but patience is often really needed. Um, Understand tribal nations are like countries with our own rules, laws, and protocols. Think of tribal leaders as presidents and as tribal councils as Congress. It's the same level of respect. These are folks and leaders that are uh, charged or responsible for ensuring the health and well-being of their respective tribal nations. And this last one is, think along the lines of consent rather than mere consultation. A lot of the trust and treaty obligation that has happened up until this point is, focused a lot on consultation, like making tribal nations aware of uh, projects or activities that may impact our communities and lands. Um, but consultation alone doesn't always necessarily imply consent. You could be consulted with, and activity could happen regardless whether you wish to or not. And so consent is a much more higher level, respectful way of, before an action is taken, making sure it's okay. And even in the tribal engagement space, just a couple things I've seen before is, you know, uh, being upfront with the engagement. Sometimes there are um, uh, events that tribal nation managers or leaders are invited to, and these events have information, which is why people are going. And but being really transparent up front, like if research is a part of these events or there's a proposal that's a part of these events, letting the tribal managers or leaders know that up front, because sometimes people can feel ambushed. If you go to get information, and then you find out by being at something that you're asked to be a part of this research thing, which a tribal manager often wouldn't have the authority to do that without checking in with our own tribal government and saying, what do you think? Is this something we should be involved with? So trying to avoid these kind of on the spot things, and putting things out there, uh, right out front so people can decide at what level we would like to participate. So my last slide here is we had a tribal climate resilience camp. It was a virtual camp last year, and the tribal managers and scientists from various organizations, including climate adaptation science centers, kind of weighed in on what is optimal engagement with tribal nations in this word cloud. And if you see some of the things that do pop out here, it is, of course, awareness, history, patience, tradition, time, respect. So, I thought this was a really good exercise, and I try to carry this with me when I talk about engagement with tribal nations. Katapatanamu, this concludes my presentation. Thank you all. I do apologize for the technical difficulties with the slideshow, but I will go ahead and perhaps close slideshow, and we have some time for questions and discussion.